Now it happened one day that Elisha went to Shunem, where there was a notable woman, and she persuaded him to eat some food. So it was, as often as he passed by, he would turn in there to eat some food. And she said to her husband, "Look now, I know that this is a holy man of God, who passes by us regularly. Please, let us make a small upper room on the wall, and let us put a bed for him there, and a table and a chair and a lampstand. So it will be, whenever he comes to us, he can turn in there." And it happened one day that he came there, and he turned in to the upper room and lay down there. Then he said to Gehazi, his servant, "Call this Shunammite woman." When he had called her, she stood before him, and he said to him, "Say now to her, 'Look, you have been concerned for us with all this care. What can I do for you? Do you want me to speak on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army?' She answered, 'I dwell among my own people.' So he said, 'What then is to be done for her?' And Gehazi answered, 'Actually, she has no son, and her husband is old.' So he said, 'Call her.' When he called her, she stood in the doorway. Then he said, 'About this time next year, you shall embrace a son.' And she said, 'No, my lord, man of God, do not lie to your maidservant.' But the woman conceived and bore a son when the appointed time had come of which Elisha had told her. And the child grew. Now it happened one day that he went out to his father to the reapers. And he said to his father, 'My head, my head.' So he said to the servant, 'Carry him to his mother.' When he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her knees till noon and then died. And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, shut the door upon him, and went out. And she called to her husband and said, 'Please, send me one of the young men and one of the donkeys, that I may run to the man of God and come back.' So he said, 'Why are you going to him today? It is neither the new moon nor the Sabbath.' And she said, 'It is well.' Then she saddled a donkey and said to her servant, 'Drive and go forward. Do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you.' And so she departed and went to the man of God at Mount Carmel. So it was, when the man of God saw her afar off, that he said to his servant Gehazi, 'Look, the Shunammite woman. Please run now to meet her and say to her, Is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with your child?' And she answered, 'It is well.' Now when she came to the man of God at the hill, she caught him by the feet. But Gehazi came near to push her away. But the man of God said, 'Let her alone, for her soul is in deep distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me.' So she said, 'Did I ask a son of my Lord? Did I not say, do not deceive me?' Then he said to Gehazi, 'Get yourself ready, and take my staff in your hand and be on your way. If you meet anyone, do not greet him, and if anyone greets you, do not answer him, but lay my staff on the face of the child.' And the mother of the child said, 'As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you.' So he arose and followed her. Now Gehazi went on ahead of them and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was neither voice nor hearing. Therefore he went back to meet him and told him, saying, 'The child is not awakened.' When Elisha came into the house, there was the child lying dead on his bed. He went in, therefore, and shut the door behind the two of them and prayed to the Lord. And he went up and lay on the child and put his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself out on the child, and the flesh of the child became warm. He returned and walked back and forth in the house, and again went up and stretched himself out on him. Then the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. And he called Gehazi and said, 'Call this Shunammite woman.' So he called her. And when she came to him, he said, pick up your son." So she went in, fell at his feet, and bowed to the ground. Then she picked up her son and went out. So again, today is Children's Day. It is not a secular holiday for which we can be grateful that it is not. Actually, it was originally created by a minister, the Reverend Dr. Charles Leonard from Chelsea, Massachusetts in 1856. So it goes back quite a ways. Children's Day was celebrated on the second Sunday in June, and it was a special day to baptize children, believe it or not. And the service itself addressed some of the special needs and problems that concern children. If one sobering observation might be made about modern times, it is this: it must be tremendously difficult to be a child in these times. Modern America has undergone a sociological revolution or transition where children are no longer considered children, but are really considered little adults. That is flawed thinking. It's dangerous. It places unrealistic expectations on children. Paul, when writing to the Corinthians, said, "When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things." The great challenge of biblical socialization is to allow children to be children and to demand that adults think and behave like adults. Perhaps that is why the Bible, both Testaments, New and Old, but especially the Old, is chock full of accounts involving children. Children occupy a prominent place in the Scriptures. They are considered a blessing. The psalmist made this clear when he wrote, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man whose quiver," that's the thing that holds the arrows, "is full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate." In other words, there's a tremendous blessing and advantage that go with bringing children into the world. The wonder-working career of Elisha, who, as you know, was the successor to Elijah, that premier prophet of the Lord in Israel, is itself quite varied and diverse. Yet, true to life, it could be said that Elisha was no stranger to emergencies. Crises of one sort or another during the last half of the 9th century BC, spanning 4 kings. His influence extended from the poor widows in debt to the wealthy and the prominent, even to the palace itself. If ever there was a relationship which merited our attention when it comes to the subject of mentoring and training, it is the relationship between Elijah and Elisha. When Elijah's time on earth was finished and he was about to be taken up to heaven, he said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I'm taken away?" And Elijah replied, "I pray thee, let me have a double portion of your spirit, that it might be upon me." In other words, let me be your rightful successor. Elijah replied, "You've asked a hard thing." What Elisha asked was not Elijah's to bestow. That's God's prerogative, whether he wants you to be in that position or not. Nevertheless, Elijah said, "If you see me when I'm actually taken up from you, it'll be done for you. But if not, it won't be." And it came to pass, as they were walking along and talking, suddenly a chariot of fire appeared, drawn by horses of fire. It drove between them, separating them, and Elijah was carried to heaven in a whirlwind. What a way to go. Thankfully, Elisha saw it. So he got his desire to be Elijah's rightful successor. Then he picked up Elijah's mantle or cloak, and he returned to the banks of the Jordan River, and he swung it down and hit the water, and the Jordan River parted, and he was able to walk across the Jordan River and begin his ministry in Israel. So we see it was the influence and the training of Elijah that was so instrumental in this young man's life. And from there on, Elisha was on the scene of crisis after crisis. For example, the city elders of Jericho came to him about their problem of polluted city water. It was causing death. It was causing infertility in wisdom. And Elisha asked for a bowl of salt. He threw it into the water system of the city, and it cured the problem. Another incident, and one, by the way, that we rarely talk about and almost never hear a sermon about, although I remember preaching one many years ago on it, is that when Elisha departed Jericho for Bethel, a gang of youth, you could say a mob, happened to be on the road, and they began mocking him, saying, "Go up, you bald head, go up." They were obviously mocking Elijah's translation to heaven, and they were saying, "You do the same, Elisha." You know what? God never winks at anyone who blasphemes his name. Mark it down. It may happen on television, it may happen in music, it may happen on the radio, it may happen in advertising, it may happen in people who have nothing but contempt for God. But he never lets anyone off the hook. So Elisha turned around, he cursed them in the name of the Lord, and 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 children, youth. Bet you're glad I didn't choose that passage for today. Then we see Elisha involved in financial crises of sorts. There's this widow of one of Elisha's fellow prophets, and she came to him in tears, and she said, "You know that my husband didn't have any money when he died, and he left me with debt, and now the creditor is coming, and he wants to take my 2 sons as slaves." And after telling her to borrow as many empty vessels as she possibly could, he told her to take that small remaining amount of olive oil she had in her cupboard and to start and begin to fill all of those vessels that her and her son gathered. And when they finished, she had enough oil to sell it and pay her debts. Next, we see him as the responding to a case of accidental food poisoning at the seminary of the prophets. Someone crushed wild gourds and put them into the stew without realizing that they were poisonous. Elisha said, "Bring me some flour." He threw it into the stew, and immediately he said, "Go ahead, boys, eat up." Now, after this, we see Elisha consulted about a health crisis. Naaman the Syrian, he is a leper, and he comes seeking deliverance from this leprosy, and he's been referred to Elisha, and he comes and stands at the door, and Elisha says, "I'm not coming out. Just go to the Jordan and dip 7 times, and you'll be clean." The man is insulted. At least I expected the prophet to come out and speak to me. But he did what he was told, as his servant urged him to do. And when he came out the 7th time, his flesh was like the flesh of a baby. Now, among all these crises, most of us would agree that death is probably the severest. And the death of a child is probably the severest in that category. The setting of today's crisis is quite simple, but the relational dynamics going on are profound to the attentive ear. Well, on one of his many trips to the town of Shunem, an elderly couple there invited the prophet to dinner, and from then on, whenever Elisha arrived in Shunem, they invited him. There was a standing invitation for him to join them for dinner. Well, this act of hospitality led the woman, the couple, to conclude that Elisha was no ordinary man. There's something about him. He is a holy man of God. And when she talked it over with her husband, she says, I think that over here we can make an addition, one of those wall rooms, and we can put a bed and a table and a chair and a lampstand in that room so that whenever he comes by, he'll be able to stay there without having to worry about renting a room or finding a place to rest. And so that's what happened. And it's good to remind ourselves that as God's servants, we need rest, and we certainly appreciate the accommodations that are made for us in parsonages and things like that. I'm reminded of D.L. Moody. Once he was asked, do you ever get sick and tired of work? And he said, I'm often tired in the work, but I'm never tired of the work. And perhaps this woman modeled what the Apostle Paul eventually taught the early church about taking widows into their membership and supporting them. He said, you know who really deserves the support? You want me to tell you who deserves the support? He says, it's those who are reported of for good works, those who have brought up children, those who have lodged strangers and washed the feet of the saints. That's what that woman was doing. She's an example of one who washed the feet of the saints. And she didn't do it out of any selfish or ulterior motives. She did it not out of a sense of obligation. She did it because she sensed a real need. And you see, one of the main problems and one of the starting points of resolving crises and of crisis intervention is to build bridges, not walls. No doubt Elisha and his servant were very grateful for what the woman did, and the accommodations served their purpose. And consequently, on a future visit, perhaps one where Elisha arrived in Shunem quite exhausted by the trip and the day's labor, and he was able to go directly to the couple's home and find a hot meal and clean room waiting for him, and his heart was touched, and he spoke to Gehazi and he said, you know what, this woman's been very kind to us. And he said, let's find out what we can do to reciprocate. And I fear that one of the chief lies of the devil today is that the church can grow even though its members withdraw more and more and become detached from the lives of others. Now, I know it's tempting. I find it very tempting. I find that's one of the hardest things to struggle against personally. You see the way things are going, you assume, you know what? If you can't beat them, join them. It's all falling apart anyway. No, that's not the attitude. To follow Jesus Christ means we're compelled not by fear, not by guilt, not by any other motive. We're compelled by love. The love of Christ constrains us. Jesus said, the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. And if the crisis today in the world is that the world is going to pot, literally and figuratively, by the way, and we say, well, they need Jesus. Jesus agrees. But someone has to be willing to go out into the highways and the byways and compel them to come in. Someone has to go out and do the seeking. Jesus will do the saving. Don't worry about that. But somebody has to do the seeking. We need to build bridges, not walls. And often it starts by how we look after one another in the family of God. Paul told the Galatians, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all men, but especially to those who are of the household of faith. As it turned out, the woman and her husband had a comfortable life among her own people. She really didn't have any special needs. But when Elisha's servant Gehazi pointed out that the couple has no children, have you noticed that? And they're now in their aged years. They're not going to have anybody to take care of them. And who's going to inherit their property? Well, the woman didn't verbalize it, nor did the man. But I think he got it right. A people, you and me, all around us people, will ultimately need somebody. We'll need somebody to care for us. Will they be there when we need them? No, it's not necessary to probe. I'm not saying that. But it is necessary to shift our attention away from ourselves and to honestly look at others and see what needs they have that may be missing. What's missing in their life? And so Elisha took care of it. By next year, you'll be holding a son in your arms. Imagine that. Parents in the golden years, like Abraham and Sarah. How thrilling. I think it should happen here. In fact, I've been praying for the over 80s in our congregation to have this same thing happen. I mean, something exciting. How interesting that on the day of Pentecost, Peter cited a prophecy. You remember that? He cited a prophecy from Joel about God pouring out his Spirit in the last days, with sons and daughters prophesying and old men dreaming dreams. And the Holy Spirit was the catalyst as it was unleashed throughout the world on Pentecost, on men, women, slaves, freemen, Jews and Gentiles alike. In other words, everything that happened to Jesus, even the cross, even his death, was completely under God's control. His words, his plans, they were never ultimately disrupted by the Roman government or by the unbelieving Jewish officials. And Peter says, furthermore, anybody who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. At first, the elderly lady thought Elisha was just pulling her leg, but the following year, she did give birth to a son, and things began to move along, and they always move along. When faith in God meets faith in God, things begin to happen when people, God's people, connect with people. Now, the crisis was this, that the child grew. We're fast-forwarding the tape a little, and was one day out in the field with his father and the servants during the harvest season. And I don't know, it was still before noontime, but he may have suffered a sunstroke or something like that. He held his head, and the father ordered a servant to carry him back to the house, and his mother cared for him until noon, and then he died. Can you imagine that? No wonder the woman says, or said to Elisha earlier, don't lie to me. Don't tease me. Because now that's exactly what it seemed to be. How would she respond? How would you respond? Well, she immediately carried him up to the room where Elisha normally stayed, and she laid him on the bed, and then she closed the door and went out. And then, without explaining the crisis to anyone, including her own husband, she saddled a donkey and told the servant to spare no horsepower, and they made the 25-mile trip to Carmel to find Elisha. Have you ever noticed that most crises in our lives demand urgency? And that's understandable. But we need to be cautious about how we proceed. I was reading that test pilots have a litmus test for evaluating problems. When something goes wrong, they are taught to ask, is this machine still flying? If the answer is yes, then there's no immediate danger and no need to overreact, which is what we often do in the first few seconds after we're aware of the crisis. Well, it was November 14th, 1969, seconds after Apollo 12 took off. The spacecraft, believe it or not, was hit with lightning. And the entire console inside began to glow with orange and red trouble lights, blinking off and on. Now, there was a temptation by the pilots to do something, but the pilots reverted to their training and they said, is this aircraft still flying in the right direction? And the answer was yes. It was still headed to the moon. So they let the lights glow, and then they addressed the individual problems one by one, and they watched the orange and the red trouble lights one by one go out, and the spacecraft resume its normal function. Now that's something to think about in any pressure situation. But the second major thing to remind ourselves in a crisis is not only to build relationships, to build bridges and to build walls, but it's to remember who we go to. The woman's first thought was about God, not man. And Elisha represented God. And so that's where she went without delay. If God had the power in the first place to make this miracle birth happen in her old age and her husband's old age, then certainly he could do something to restore her child's life now. But that laid the onus, the responsibility on Elisha. So the next question is, how did Elisha respond? Did he start and press buttons and switches without knowing what he was doing? No. First he told Gehazi to make a beeline for their apartment at the woman's home and to lay my staff on the child's face. That sounds a bit strange, doesn't it? Well, Elisha's staff represented his prophetic ministry. And so Gehazi went and did what he was told, but nothing happened. You see, merely routine performances of our duties, even though they may be religious, never reap successful spiritual results. It doesn't work that way. At the woman's insistence, Elisha went straight to the dead lad, and putting everyone out of the room, he closed the door and prayed for the life of the boy. Now, I'm not dismissing the medical industry. I'm not dismissing doctors and nurses, surgeons, EMTs, ambulances. But I am saying this. Too often we rely on man. Too often our first thoughts are, what does science say? Do you know that almost every miracle in the Bible defies science? That's why we call it a miracle. It means that God suspends the normal patterns of the natural world and how it functions, and he brings to pass his own will and his own purpose. And Elisha's prayers were mixed with symbolism. He stretched out his body on the child so that his mouth, eyes, and hands corresponded to the lad's, and eventually the lad's body became warm. Something similar to what Jesus did when he spit on the ground and he made a plaster, remember? And he took it and made a plaster out of it, and he put it on the eyes of the blind man and made him see again. See, we want some kind of, we want to do something, don't we? Well, let's do what's really important. Let's talk to God. And Elisha did that, and he walked back and forth in the house in anticipation, because faith breeds faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Whoever comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek. Do you believe that? I mean, tomorrow morning when you get up and the thoughts immediately drill into your head of what you face, do you really and honestly believe that God says that you will be rewarded if you seek him in faith? And the child sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. This was not cardiopulmonary resuscitation. This was the power of God. God demonstrated his power on a body that had been dead for several hours. Now, last Sunday, I had the opportunity to worship up in the northeast part of the state in a town that I rarely go to, but I grew up on the fringes of that town, and it was not my home church, but some of my siblings attend there now regularly. Actually, it's a gorgeous sanctuary. It's maintained immaculately. And I sat there in a sanctuary maybe twice the size of our sanctuary here, and I can't help it. I felt somewhat sad. I looked around and I counted the people. But there's empty pews here. I know that faithfulness is important. Don't misunderstand me. I know faithfulness in God's work is especially important. But you know what? So is fruitfulness. Jesus said, "In this is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit." I don't know of any crisis greater than people not coming to Christ. People not meeting the God who created them and the Savior who died for them. I don't know of any other crisis. I don't know of any other crisis than somebody in the last moments of their life, and I'm with them in the hospital room, and they really don't know where they're going. A revival? Yeah, we need a revival. But it's a crisis that can be met. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and to the Gentile. That's quite an offer. Whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. A crisis that's been met. All we really need to do is share the news. God give us the grace to do that. Amen.